Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And it's another one of our All Things Africa edition. We continue to explore the history and current affairs of each African country. We're continuing to explore Southern Africa, the Southern African region. And this episode, we look at the history and current affairs of the country formerly known as Swaziland, now Eswatini. And who better to teach us about this country or any African country than our historical guide, our tour guide, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Reports. Abayomi is a longtime historian, journalist, Pan-Africanist, leftist, and anti-imperialist campaigner. And just before we begin, a reminder to our audience to always please share One Plus One widely. All of One Plus One's content, past and present episodes, our playlists help us overcome the far-right algorithms and dominant monopoly Western corporate and Western state media and pseudo-leftist websites have in the social media world by sharing our content. Share us across social media, email, and please donate if you can to One Plus One on our PayPal. And if people are having trouble and would prefer an alternative form of donation, please get in touch with me at youri@gmail.com. And sometimes Facebook blocks my ability to share One Plus One. So again, please share widely. It helps the show immensely. It's our only way of overcoming colonial, pro-imperialist, sexist, heteronormative, and racist media. And folks, don't forget to help out my friend, colleague, comrade, Chris Richards, the eclectic radical who is struggling with unemployment. Become a patron of his, because if you help Chris out, you're helping me out and us wanting to do future journalism projects, which we would like to do. But we need people donating in order to do that. And before we get to the topic at hand, Abayomi. So before we talk about Swaziland, it was May Day. Not only was it May Day officially last Friday when we did our episode, but it was May Day weekends, and so I have to ask you. You're from Detroit. You're from you're based in Detroit. You're based in Michigan, which used to be one of the great manufacturing centers of the universe. And I mean, and despite institutional racism that our people and other people of color face in Michigan, it still was one of the few places where there was sort of kind of like a black mecca in a way. Communities which are very similar to Harlem in New York, and lots of the working class has been has been crushed a lot, decade after decade, since the dawn of the dark ages of the Reagan era. So I have to ask, what was because you attended some May Day rallies, some May Day marches, and some other left wing events. What was the weekend like in Detroit? Please do tell us.
It was quite interesting because this year was somewhat different. The AFL-CIO, Central Labor Council, did take up the task of holding a May Day rally at Roosevelt Park, which is located in an area that used to be heavily industrialized. The community groups, like the group I belong to and others, organized the demonstration after the rally. We also had literature tables set up as well. But it rained heavily during the morning, but it did dry up later on in the afternoon. The rally didn't start until about 4 o'clock. They had speakers from the United Auto Workers. They had people from the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union. They brought in a busload of people and others, from the trade union movement. And then afterwards, of course, we led a demonstration down Michigan Avenue to the Immigration and Custom Enforcement, the ICE Detention Center, which is also located on Michigan Avenue, and also to the federal building to protest the horrendous immigration policies of the Trump administration, as well as to protest war and other atrocities that are being committed by the Trump regime. So overall, I thought it was a good action. Hopefully next year it'll be even bigger, and hopefully we won't get rained on next year either. But across the United States, there's a coalition called May Day Strong, and May Day Strong, you can look up their website. They have listings of all the different May Day demonstrations and rallies across the U.S.
Yeah.
They were saying it was 3,000. That's hard to believe, but maybe they were talking about 3,000 around the world. But there were a lot of May Day demonstrations. Some are very large, like in cities like Chicago and New York, Los Angeles. So there's growing class consciousness amid, this creeping fascism that's taking place inside the United States, and also the rise of the far right here in the U.S. as well as in other countries, the U.K., for example, France, Germany. The ultra right, is responding to the crisis in capitalism and the failure of imperialism to deliver on increased living standards and jobs in the West. So it's a very interesting period that we're living in. Some people think we may be heading towards a civil war here in the United States, another civil war, because the intractable positions taken by the ultra right, and somebody has to respond to that on a defensive as well as an offensive basis. We'll see what happens over the next few years, but we have elections coming up, midterm elections later on this year, and we know that the Supreme Court just recently struck down a redistricting policy in the state of Louisiana, which in all likelihood will wipe out African American representation. Yesterday in Tennessee and the day before, they voted to redistrict or to carve up District 9, which is around Memphis, Tennessee, which is probably the largest and blackest city, predominantly black city in the United States, next to Detroit, perhaps. And there's been demonstrations in Memphis as well. So it's going to be a very, very contentious year. And I think that there's going to be more demonstrations, more protests, boycotts to come.
Quick question before we get to Swaziland, Eswatini, forgive me. You mentioned this huge gutting of the Voting Rights Act and the far right Supreme Court, and it is a far right Supreme Court and a very corporatist Supreme Court, packed with mostly far right Republicans. They, of course, did not object to it. I think the Supreme Court last I checked basically said that there's no need to enforce the Voting Rights Act or any of these landmark civil rights bills because, in their opinion, there's no more racism in the U.S. All that civil rights stuff is all it's all done. So for people who do follow American politics but might not know some of the nuances, can you explain to them what the Voting Rights Act was and what this bizarre thing is of redistricting, which is basically, how should I put it? Well actually, go ahead and explain to our audience.
Well, after the Civil War, the question was, what do you do with 4.5 million Africans? So there were proposals to send them to other countries outside the United States. That wasn't feasible or plausible. So the passage of the 13th Amendment ostensibly freed the formerly enslaved. And then in 1866, there was a Civil Rights Act that was passed that was pretty comprehensive. If you go back and read the Civil Rights Act of 1866, I mean, it calls for, total human rights, civil rights, and also calls for the federal government to help enforce the civil rights of the formerly enslaved. Well, there were still problems. And by 1868, there was the passage of another constitutional amendment, the 14th Amendment, which ostensibly granted legalized status, citizenship, the right to serve on juries, to be represented in a court of law. Then 2 years later, in 1870, there was the passage of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave African-American men, ostensibly, the right to vote, because women did not have the right to vote on a national level until 1919, 1920. Some states did change it earlier than that, but there was the passage of the amendment to the Constitution did not take place until 1920, after World War One. So that was suppressed. After the decline of Reconstruction, based on a compromise of 1876, 1877, the federal government withdrew troops from the formerly Confederate states in the South, and they reinstituted racism by law, the period of so-called Jim Crow, where they passed codes that prohibited African Americans from voting. So this went on for years and decades, up until 1965. In 1964, there was a Civil Rights Act passed, which dealt with the right to have access to public facilities, jobs, and so forth. And then in '65, as a result of the Selma campaign, largely, the Voting Rights Act was signed on August 6th of 1965. Now, that act had several provisions that provided for the enforcement of voting rights laws. Because it's one thing to pass a law, but if it's not enforced, it means basically nothing. Mm-hmm. So over the years, 2013, there was the Holder versus Alabama, and Alabama versus Shelby versus Holder, which is a case in Alabama which struck down the enforcement provisions. And of course, this recent case pretty much struck down the ability to create districts that would guarantee African Americans representation, largely in the South, within the U.S. Congress. So that's where we are right now, and it's anticipated that several states would redraw these districts where African Americans have representation. It happened in Memphis this week. So yeah, it's going to be a struggle coming up in the next few months.
Yes, and redistricting, that's the politically nice, politically polite term for basically gerrymandering. Basically, it's cheating.
Yeah, so, I mean, so
sort of to describe people, what redistricting is. So this is a map of Africa. Let's just pretend it's let's just pretend it's it's a state I used to live in, San Francisco, and something like that. So I, the Republican, can say can look at this part and go, it's mostly black, and Latino. They mostly vote for Democrats. I, the congressperson, though, am going to just split it like this.
Yeah,
there's a few there's a few pockets full of Republicans there, and in the next election against my opponent, I am most likely going to win because I choose the district. It's not the voters who choose the representatives. The representatives choose their voters, in a nutshell, correct?
Exactly. That's what's happening. And when you have a concentrated population of African Americans, they split it in three different parts in Memphis. So the dominant demographic in those three areas will be Caucasians, who they feel will, in all likelihood, vote for Republicans. So you could wind up with no black representation in Tennessee, Louisiana, and other states in the U.S. So in essence, that's just Jim Crow 2.0 in essence. So I don't think people are going to sit down and tolerate this. People in Memphis are very angry. They're angry around the country. So we'll see what happens in the next few weeks and the next few months. But it shows a degree of racism that still persists in the United States. And under the Trump administration, it's becoming even more emboldened, racism and fascism, and they want to ensure white domination and white supremacy in perpetuity.
Yeah, and
even though the demographics of the United States are shifting dramatically.
Yeah,
towards people of color majority in this country.
Yeah, no, and it was quite scandalous when George W. Bush stole. He did not win. He stole the
The
election in
2000 elections.
2000. They,
Yeah,
they were doing shenanigans like this. They were looking at the voter rolls of the mostly, of the large black community in Florida who were all going to vote heavily in favor for Al Gore, and then they just started to suppress them and suppress them and suppress them. That's why it was so contentious. Now, there was a recount that was happening when all of that nonsense was happening. Jeb Bush, George W. Bush's brother, was the governor of Florida at the
right.
time, and there was all sorts of voter intimidation that was also happening. There was a recount that was going on, but then the Supreme Court of the U.S., which was a mostly again Republican majority court, then stopped the recount and then basically George W. Bush became president like that. Trump actually, it's amazing how this scandal, how a lot of the left didn't champion this. But Donald Trump, even when he won against Hillary Clinton, he also was engaging. The Republicans were also engaging in all sorts of voter suppression of largely black voters, yellow Americans, Asian American voters, and brown voters, and yet the Democrats did not take this up. And it was in your home state of Michigan that this was happening. A lot of voter suppression, people being wrongly kicked off of the voter rolls and stuff like that under false accusations that they were stealing the vote from the Republicans, but it was the other way. But it was the other way around. And yet Democrats chose to scapegoat non-existent Russian interference as opposed to Republican voter suppression.
Yeah, that's pretty absurd that they believe that the Russian Federation would have that kind of influence to sway people in the United States to vote for an ultra-right candidate in the personage of a Donald Trump. So they didn't say anything in 2024 when Trump was designated as the winner, but there was an extreme amount of voter suppression in 2024 that guaranteed the second administration of Trump. So we'll see what happens later on this year during the midterm elections, but they want to maintain control of both the House and the Senate, and they're setting up the mechanism now in order to do that.
Yes, and folks, check out the great work of Greg Greg Palast. I'll actually make sure to even put those in the pinned comment section because he's done fantastic work exposing how Bush stole that election. Also, credit to Michael Moore for that, and also how Trump stole the 2016 election. And he stresses it was not the Russians that got Trump to win. So,
Yeah.
so now on to the topic at hand, our All Africa edition. So, Abayomi, as always, tell us what was Swaziland, Eswatini like before British colonialism? Then how did it become a British colony? And when under British Anglo-English rule, what were the conditions like, the socioeconomic conditions like for the people of Eswatini?
Well, like the other countries in the immediate Southern Africa region, the initial inhabitants, as recorded by archaeological digs and oral histories, were the Khoisan, who were the heavily hunting and gathering people, and they can be traced back in the region to the early portions of the Stone Age, which goes back to anywhere between 3 million before the Common Era, all the way up until about 3 or 4,000 before the Common Era. So there's been human settlement in Swaziland and other neighboring countries in the region going back many millenniums. Of course, other forces came in, the so-called Bantu, which we've talked about before.
Yeah.
The people who had a different genotype, perhaps, came in and they brought in pastoral economies, agricultural economies, iron tools, iron works, and that began around the 4th century AD. And the people in Swaziland, of course, were impacted by developments that were taking place in neighboring countries, in Mozambique, in ancient Zimbabwe, and also in South Africa. So what happened was that there was a consolidation of the various groups within the Swaziland or the Swazi speaking populations, beginning around the mid 18th century with Ngwani the third, who was one of the best known chiefs or kings in what became known as Swaziland during the 18th century. There was a succession largely based upon kinship that developed from the 18th through the 19th century. And as that proceeded, there began to be more dislocation, as particularly the Boers, the so-called Afrikaners, as they expanded in their competition with the British, began to infringe upon the land that is today known as Swaziland as well. So these are some of the variables that led to the consolidation of Swaziland as a nation, as a kingdom. And of course, they emerged during the 19th century with several very important historical figures. We could talk about Sibusa, Mswati II, and there was also the advent of queen mothers alongside the monarchs. And these queen mothers were very instrumental because some of them ruled after their sons passed away or when their children were too young, after their husbands passed away and their children were too young to maintain dominance within those societies. They took over and led various civilizations during this particular time period. So this is very, very important to recognize. For example, Labu Tabendi Mduli was a prominent queen mother she lived between 1859 and 1925. And she was formidable, very well known in the Southern Africa region, and also played a role in beating back the Boers and making an alliance with the British. This was all done during from the period of the late 19th century to the early part of the 20th century. So you can't separate the developments in Swaziland from what was taking place in neighboring Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and South Africa.
And how did it become a British colony, and what were the conditions, the socioeconomic conditions like of the people of Eswatini when it became a British colony?
Well, when you had the expansion of the Voortrekkers, the Boers, they needed protection, they needed alliances, so they made an alliance with the British. Now, this alliance with the British was not necessarily a voluntary alliance. It was a question of survival on the part of the Swaziland people. And eventually they became a protectorate of the British, along with Basutoland, which is a neighboring country, as well as Botswanaland, which we talked about last week, which is modern day Botswana and modern day Lesotho. So they did have warrior kings, they did have fighters, and they fought against the Boers as well as fighting alongside the British in order to curtail Boer expansionism into the Swazi territories. But yes, they did become a protectorate beginning in the early part of the 20th century.
And talk a bit more about about what the conditions like for the people when they were under Anglo rule.
Well, they lost a lot of land. That was one thing, a lot of livestock. And the founding of the mining industry in South Africa during the 1860s through the 1880s also had an impact in terms of power struggles. The Anglo-Boer War, which took place at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, also had an impact because people were fleeing the fighting, and they also were trying to gain more territory, that is the Boers as well as the British. So they wanted protection from the Voortrekkers, the Boer expansions, and that's how the current kingdom of Swaziland was demarcated, beginning in the late 19th century, extending to the early part of the 20th century. But as I mentioned, the people there lost a considerable amount of land and livestock. And during the period when you had the growth of the mining industry, a lot of people were siphoned off from Swaziland into South Africa to work in these mines.
Under terrible conditions, correct?
Very, very horrible conditions and under basically slave labor conditions. Very little money. People were dislocated from their lands, and they were subjected to heavy repression on the part of both the Boers as well as the British.
And remind people, because this is one of those policies of the British I find one of the most scandalous, which was the hut tax. We've talked about it before, but do remind
Yes.
our audience about the hut tax, because that's probably the most, mind
Well,
baffling
yes,
and criminal.
stealing people's land and then forcing them to work and working in order to pay taxes on land that was stolen from them. So it's really a counterintuitive, very vicious, exploitative system. And it happened on various parts of the African continent. We talked about it in regard to Tanganyika. Um, they had to deal with that under the Germans and later under the British, and other countries throughout the region were subjected to these taxes after land seizure.
Yeah, very regressive and very inhumane.
Yes.
Now, when Eswatini became independent from Britain, was it one of violent struggle or a peaceful transfer of power?
It was a combination of both. As I mentioned earlier, they did fight against the Boer expansion during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And then during the 20th century, under British protection, so to speak, they were still subjected to discrimination and they were still fighting to regain their land, to stop the partitioning of Swaziland that was divided up into concession areas and areas that were controlled ostensibly by the monarchy, the traditional leaders inside the country. So what happened was that in light of, for example, these encroachments on the part of their land and the necessity of fighting, for example, the South African Land Act, which was passed around the time of the Union of South Africa was formed. The Union was formed as an alliance between the British and the Boers, the so-called Afrikaners. And but the Land Act took most of the land away from the African people and turned it over to the Europeans. So there was an effort to fight this. So in 1912, you had the formation of the South African National Native Council, which later became the African National Congress. And Swaziland, particularly under uh, the Queen Regent, who we talked about earlier, and her name, of course, was Labo Sabini Mkludi. She lived between 1859 and 1925. They joined the predecessor to the ANC in 1912 and also participated in 1914 in these conferences that were held to oppose the South African Land Act. So from the beginning, they actually were heavily involved in the resistance to the Land Act, which was really a land confiscation act. And they even provided money, for example, some £3,000 to help in the funding of the predecessor to the African National Congress. So in that sense, it was progressive, but considering the fact that a lot of their people had been wiped out, dislocated, they had their land confiscated and divided, the population was relatively small in comparison to what existed in South Africa. But the people kept fighting, and by the 1950s, early 1960s, there were demands for national independence. And there was, of course, in the early 1960s, the formation of political parties in Swaziland. The Unfortunately, a lot of the political activity was centered around the monarchy. So they had their
Yes.
own political party that supported them, but there were other parties that formed that were more secular and called for the imposition of democratic elections in the country.
And
But
that's
go
oh,
ahead.
well, that's a perfect segue to this. So now, Eswatini, unlike most African countries that have had multiple dictators, often of the far right, backed by the West, or very right-wing, right-leaning parties whose leaders act very autocratic, or communist dictatorships, or very frail systems of multi-party democracy, where even if left-wing, left-leaning parties govern, they often behave like right-wingers, or they have too much rope tied behind their arms. Eswatini, I think, not since the monarch of Ethiopia, which was abolished by the Derg in the 70s, but I believe Eswatini is the only, well, it's not the only monarch, but it's the only absolute monarch that governs an African nation. Would you like, yeah, would you like to comment on this before we get into the legacies of the different leaders of Eswatini?
Yeah, I would say that. And now Morocco, they claim it's not an absolute monarchy. I believe it is. I
Oh,
mean,
of course. How could
they
I forget
still have,
Morocco?
yeah.
Yes.
And Lesotho is a constitutional monarchy. They have a king, um, and this king does, of course, recognize a parliament and a prime minister. So, in that sense, they're not an absolute monarchy. Letizia the third is a constitutional monarchy. He's the head of state, but they do have elections. They have many political parties. This is in the kingdom of Lesotho. In Botswana, for example, the monarch there is pretty much dissolved. They have a republic. It's considered a republic of Botswana, but Swaziland is still considered a kingdom. And when it became independent, it was still a kingdom. It became independent in 1968, whereas Botswana and Lesotho became independent in 1966. These were the three ostensibly British protectorates in Southern Africa, and they were given the right to decide their own destiny during the mid to late 1960s. Now, under independence, though, it remained a monarchy, even though there were political parties inside the country. And eventually, those parties will be dissolved by decree on the part of the monarchy.
Then and in fact, some breaking news. Earlier this week, when Yves Engler was doing the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, he mentioned that Canada
Yes.
supports Morocco's claim to Western Sahara. So that's a huge blow in the international world to Western Sahara's self-determination. And of course, yes, we can't talk about, the few monarchs that do exist in Africa without mentioning the Kingdom of Morocco. Now, going back to
Yes, which is very, very pro-U.S. In fact, just recently, two U.S. servicemen have disappeared in Morocco, and they've had like hundreds and hundreds of Moroccan as well as U.S. troops trying to find these two soldiers. What are they doing there? They're not saying exactly what they're doing yet. Unlike, in all likelihood, they're part of the U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, and they're there working with the Moroccan government to maintain stability. And of course, you mentioned the Western Sahara question, which is still unresolved.
yeah, and shame on Canada for taking that decision.
Yeah, they're following
Now,
the U.S.
exactly. So now going back to Swaziland.
Yeah.
So how do you assess the legacy? Firstly, the socioeconomic legacy of King Sabuza II. Apologies if I'm butchering his name. Who ruled from September the 2nd, 1968, until he died in office August 21st, 1986. Did he govern more to the left or more to the right? And feel free to talk about any positives he did, or if you view his legacy as largely negative.
No, he definitely ruled from the right, and they dissolved uh, the parliament that they have. They had. They also just banned political parties that existed, and this all occurred between 1968 and 1973. At one point, they had reconstituted the parliament. Then it was banned again in the late 1970s. So yes, it's largely a monarchical system that developed and has remained as such for many, many years. And in 1987, Mswati took over, Mswati III, who is still now the kingdom, the king, the head of state
Yeah.
in Eswatini, what they call it now.
And actually, before we talk about him, then let me
Mhm.
ask Then let me ask this follow up question about his father. What was his foreign policy legacy? Was he allied with the Western imperialist states of the U.S., Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, NATO, and the EU that was developing, or was he non-aligned and leaned more to the USSR, the Eastern European Communist Bloc, Cuba, Vietnam, or largely non-aligned but leaned more to the Western camp?
No, they were clearly aligned with the West. There's no question about it. And that probably had a lot to do with the small population, the lack of economic development, but also the legacy of being a British protectorate. I'm sure had a role to play as well. But they felt extremely threatened, even by their own people, even though the majority of the people still live in rural areas in Swaziland. And the people who live in the cities tend to be more democratically oriented and have a stronger tendency to join labor unions and to be involved in protests. But the majority of the people still remain in rural areas.
Well, that's a perfect segue into this question. So, since April the 25th, 1986, Eswatini has been governed by Prince, now King Mswati III. Actually, how do you pronounce his last name? Because I know because you pronounce their last names perfectly.
And Swati,
Okay.
and Swati the third, yeah, right, yeah.
Okay, so Mswati the third.
Mhm.
So, in terms of socioeconomics, how do you assess his time in office in the 1980s and then the 1990s, where it's the dawn of a unipolar world dominated by the U.S. and its capitalist allies, and then the 2000s and 2010s? And in terms of social mobility, life expectancy, child mortality, infant mortality, has he been a good leader or little to be desired?
Yeah, I think most people in the region would say he's not been a good leader. He's suppressed the democratic movement. He has done a lot of things in terms of jailing opposition people. People have been assassinated. For example, the People's Democratic Movement of Swaziland, Pudimo, was banned almost immediately by the Swaziland government after it was formed in the early 1980s. So, yes, a lot of their people were thrown in prison. They were driven out of the country, and some were assassinated or died in prison. So that gives you an idea of the hostility they have towards any type of democratic system.
And in terms of foreign policy, has he largely been an ally? Has he continued to largely be an ally to the Western imperialist camp, or more neutral largely?
Clearly an ally to the Western imperialist camp, far to the right. Um, they still recognize Taiwan, as a legitimate government, as opposed to the People's Republic of China. In fact, just just recently, um, several African countries denied the use of their airspace by the president of Taiwan, the so-called Republic of China, to travel to Eswatini. So that shows how, you know, reactionary they are as a state. And they've also agreed and have accepted deportees from the United States, these people who are illegally being deported from the US, absent of due process. They've agreed to take some of these people in to put them in prisons in Eswatini. It's pretty outrageous
Wow.
what's going on. So yes, they recognize Taiwan as a legitimate government of the People's Republic of China or of the Chinese people as a whole, and they collaborating with the Trump administration in regard to its illegal deportations.
Well, you
But in
already
terms of economic policy, the majority of the people still remain poor. Over half the people although they're young, remain impoverished, even though they're considered a lower middle income country. And a lot of that probably has to do with the fact that they have introduced the textile industry since 2000, where they're producing textiles, and also they are large sugar producers. I think the fourth largest sugar producers on the African continent. So they export a lot of sugar to the European Union countries, and also they produce textiles for export to the European Union and the United States. Now, in terms of the exports of textiles, it's highly questionable right now because when Trump came in, he eliminated the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act that had been instituted by Bill Clinton at the conclusion of his administration in 2000. He just eliminated it. So a lot of people lost their jobs. Lesotho was a main participant in AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and they had set up factories that took textiles and transformed them into garments and clothing. But tens of thousands of people have lost their jobs since the advent of the Trump administration. He said he was going to extend it momentarily, at least on a temporary basis, but there's no long-term planning for the extension of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. So therefore, a lot of people have been made unemployed. You know, people
Wow.
who have moved into the urban areas in order to work in these factories are find themselves unemployed and may have to go back to rural areas in order to survive.
Well, and you also already mentioned that Eswatini has very bad relations with China. The Cold War still has not ended between them. But
No,
what are Eswatini's relations with other members of BRICS, if it has any, or and do they have any special? Yeah, yeah. Any
they have some
relations
relations
with any of
with
the other members
the
of
People's Republic of China in terms of some type of economic relations, but it's very limited, quite limited, because they want to maintain relations with Taiwan. But other BRICS countries, South Africa, for example, would be the strongest because their economy is heavily dependent upon South African granting access for trade and other forms of economic activity. Like 70% of their imports come from South Africa, and most of their exports have to go through South Africa. Some do go through neighboring Mozambique because there's a rail line from Eswatini through to the coast of Mozambique. But yes, they have very good relations with South Africa because they have really no other choice in regard to their exports as well as imports.
and because of some foolish foreign policy decisions that the monarch chooses to make. Then I have to ask this question, which is, what's been Eswatini's response to the African Spring, as I call it, the anti-French wave in West Africa, and all the upheavals happening there? And what's been the current monarch's response to Africa?
Well, in terms of the what's happening with the French, largely in West Africa, uh, they probably don't have a position on that because they're a former British protectorate, and I don't see them taking a position in opposition to France in another part of Africa. So I don't think they really have a position on that. And even if they did, I don't think it would be a revolutionary or progressive position
Yeah.
because they tend to be more pro-Western in their foreign policy orientation and even in regard to domestic policy, with the exception of being opposed to bourgeois democracy.
Unbelievable. My second's last question is this: is there a strong left wing opposition in Swaziland? And if not, why is that the case? Or do talk about the major left wing opposition, and do they all want to abolish the monarchs, or would they like to have constitutional monarchs like the Nordic countries, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg?
Well, as we mentioned before, the People's Democratic Movement of Swaziland, PUDIMO, uh, was pretty
Communist.
much eliminated.
It's a communist party, right? Explicitly communist party.
Well, no, not that one. The CPS came in about 15 years ago. They just celebrated their 15th anniversary, but PUDIMO was aligned with the ANC and the South African Communist Party and other progressive forces in South Africa. But their leadership was jailed. They were denied the right to participate in electoral politics. Some of their people were assassinated or died in detention. So they pretty much were wiped out as a political organization. In 2011, you had the founding of the Communist Party of Swaziland, which has been very active, particularly over the last 5 years inside the country. Now, both of these parties were completely anti-monarchy. They call for the elimination of the monarchy, and they have various reasons why. They said it's backward, that it steals money from the people, has an incorrect foreign policy, and it's repressive. The Communist Party of Swaziland has pretty much the same position. They want the adoption of a democratic system, revolutionary democratic system in Swaziland. They opposed the renaming of the country, which took place about 4 or 5 years ago,
Yeah.
to Eswatini from Swaziland. The monarchy in Eswatini says that the term Eswatini is more traditional, and that Swaziland is a hangover from the British colonial system. But they waited a lot of years, which they had time to change the name to actually change it.
Funny
So it's
how,
quite interesting.
funny how that's the one colonial hangover they want to get rid of, and not the economic
Not the
system.
bourgeois, I know, not the monarchy, none of that stuff. So yes, the Communist Party of Swaziland has been very active, but at the same time, they've been imprisoned, driven into exile. Some of their leaders have been killed. So they just issued a statement. In fact, they have a website. People can check it out. The Communist Party of Swaziland has a website, and they issued a statement on the 15th anniversary of their founding, which was just last month, reiterating their opposition to the monarchy and the demand for a transition to a revolutionary democratic system in Swaziland. They have a complaint with the Southern African development community because they feel very strongly. Now, Eswatini is a part of the SADC. They feel very strongly that SADC should not recognize them because of their undemocratic practice. And that's the criticism they have of the Southern African development community. But the Southern African development community has not taken a position against the monarchy. I mean, they could impose sanctions that South Africa could refuse to trade with Swaziland, which would be a major blow to their economy, which is very weak as it is anyway. But that has not been their position. I think SADC within its charter ostensibly refuses or should not interfere in the internal affairs of its member states. So this is how they get out of not taking a strong position against the monarchy in Swaziland. But the Communist Party of Swaziland is heavily allied with the South African Communist Party, and South African Communist Party has been trying to give whatever support they can, but it's very, very difficult. And a lot of the meetings that are held of the Communist Party of Swaziland are held in South Africa due to the fact that it's banned inside of Eswatini.
Yeah, no, it's actually quite impressive looking at a lot of the opposition Swaziland. A lot of them are either far left, revolutionary left, or very much social democratic reformists and so forth. So
Now, I think PUDIMO was an affiliate of Socialist International, uh,
yes,
but the CPS they get invited, to these congresses of communist and workers organizations internationally. They're there right alongside the Communist Party of China, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which still exists, as it's the main opposition in the Russian Federation. The largest opposition is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. Uh, but yes, they are very much a part of the World Socialist Movement. That is the CPS, the Communist Party of Swaziland.
Yeah.
So they're perhaps the furthest to the left of any of the opposition parties inside the country. It's a small country. The population is only like 1.2 million. And as I mentioned, there's still a lot of poverty inside of the country. And the main export that's developed there is sugar, along with the export of textiles that are produced in conjunction with other Western imperialist states.
Before I ask, my last question, I actually did want to talk about SADC because I was doing
Yeah.
some, because I was actually preparing some research and doing some research into Lesotho, which we might do next week or the week after, and I was just and like the Google AI mentioned SADC and asked if I would be interested in why leftists and why critical leftists and Pan-Africanist leftists are critical of SADC, and I thought, yeah, sure, no problem. And wow, I was actually quite shocked at how. Anyways, talk about SADC and why Pan-Africanist leftists, Marxists, and whatnot should be opposed to it because it's quite astounding how this is still allowed to exist. This setup.
Well, yeah, it was formed in 1992 in Windhoek, Namibia. This is 2 years after Namibia became independent. In fact, I was in Namibia when they were holding the founding Congress of the Southern African Development Community. It is a successor of the Southern African Developmental Coordinating Conference, which was formed in 1980. And the whole idea was to undermine the South African Customs Union and also to build unity in the struggle to totally liberate South Africa. That was the first one, the Southern African Development Coordinating Conference, was formed in 1980. That grew out of the frontline states. The frontline states were designed to provide assistance and aid to the people that were fighting the settler colonial regime in Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, and of course later Namibia and the Republic of South Africa. So in 1992, SADC was formed. They do have, in reality, one of the most cohesive secretariats and unity within the region. They have been able to intervene and stop, potential conflict that's taking place in the Southern Africa region. They've added new countries. For example, the Democratic Republic of Congo is a member of the Southern African Development Community. The Union of Comoros, Seychelles are also members as well, and Mauritius and Madagascar. So, yeah, they have done that. But the main criticism, as I see it, whether it's in coming largely out of Swaziland itself and also out of the South African Communist Party, is that they should isolate Eswatini because it is not democratic, and that they should pressure them to hold multi-party elections, if not abandon the monarchy, at least be able to set up a parliament and have one person, one vote.
Interesting, and no doubt, Eswatini, like any Southern African country, or Eastern or Western or the Horn of Africa, Central, and even parts of the North, though not as extreme. There is shocking levels of poverty and people living in absolute destitution. Isn't the only solution to these grave ills socialism, radical socialism, Pan-Africanist leftism? And if there's any other final thoughts you'd like to say about Eswatini, please feel free to say them.
Yeah, they've had a serious problem with HIV and AIDS infections for possibly 3 decades, one of the highest in Africa and perhaps one of the highest in the world.
Wow.
Even though the population is extremely small, probably has a lot to do with the underdevelopment inside the country. But yeah, that is one of the major problems that they have, in addition to poverty. The poverty rate is well over 50%, even though the population is heavily youthful. People under 20, 21 years old constitute the majority of the people in Swaziland or Eswatini. But yes, the healthcare crisis is a major issue that the monarchy should tackle, but they're busy suppressing the democratic movement, whether it's a bourgeois democratic movement or a left opposition movement. A lot of their resources are focused on suppressing democracy and ensuring that the monarchy maintains their dominance in Eswatini.
Unbelievable. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with our always brilliant history teacher and our tour guide, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire and frequent contributor to Black Agenda Reports. Folks, check out Abayomi's work and that of his colleagues. Subscribe to both outlets, buy his books, and donate generously to Black Agenda Reports. And again, donate to 1+1. Share us widely, like us. Don't forget to help, support my colleague, friend, and comrade Chris by becoming a patron of his, sharing his work, joining him on Substack, and you support Chris, you support us, and help us possibly do interesting indie journalism projects. Now, for next week, I'll keep people updated via my YouTube post what's happening next week, but unless anything changes, then next week we'll look at the country of Lesotho. I'll be in touch with my I'll be in touch with my comrade Sean if next week we do a Zimbabwe debate or if it's going to be on some other dates. He's even asked if it's possible that if we also do things that's not Friday. So anywho, so I'll keep people updated on that planning. But unless anything changes, then we're going to do the following. Next week, the country we're going to be looking at is Lesotho. I've already done some research on it, and it's going to be fascinating to also explore that country. so
Yeah,
until then, folks, enjoy the weekend. Good night and good luck. And Abayomi, as always, thank you for all you give us.
thank you.